My name is Ann Runyon, and I am 2080 Strategy Execution's Director of Commercial Marketing. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all today to our webinar, Bridging Strategy and Project Execution for Success. Before we get started today, I wanted to take a moment to briefly introduce our organization as we have recently launched our new brand. 2080 Strategy Execution is the integration of ESI International and IPS Learning, two organizations you may be familiar with a rich legacy of over 35 years of experience and client successes. We offer performance education solutions that transform the way individuals and organizations think, lead, execute, and perform project-based work. We have proudly trained 2 million plus professionals within 56 countries, awarded more than 120,000 client certifications, and assisted organizations around the globe with project-focused assessments and talent development to better guarantee project success and alignment of strategy to execution. Now to cover off on a few logistical items for today's presentation. With this conference platform, you will be able to either stream audio through your computer or dial in via telephone. For improved clarity and volume, we encourage you to dial into the telephone bridge using the phone number and passcode provided within both the webinar confirmation and reminder emails. All attendees have been placed in a listen-only mode. That said, we still want to hear from you. If you have a question or comment at any time during today's webinar, please send it through the question chat feature located in the control panel on your screen. Simply type in and submit your questions for our presenter or comments to our moderator. We will host a Q&A session at the conclusion of this presentation and will address as many submitted questions as time will allow. And finally, this webinar will be recorded. We will make the link to the recording available to you early next week so that you can share these insights with colleagues or choose to review the material again yourself. Your presenter today is John Warren, Vice President of Strategic Business Solutions for 2080 Strategy Execution. John has more than 30 years experience in managing complex interdisciplinary programs with expertise in strategic management consulting, planning, and facilitation for cross-functional global executive teams. He assists with supporting clients across the globe, as well as leads the practitioner-based research and development that support the Stanford Advanced Project Management Program within the Stanford Center for Professional Development. John has an MBA from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. Without further ado, it is my sincere pleasure to turn the session over to your presenter. John, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks a lot, Ann, and thanks to all of you. I know none of you have anything to do today, right? So lots of work. I'm talking to you from Boise, Idaho, in the upper parts of the U.S. We are in a big rainstorm here, which we love because we don't have a lot of rain. So thanks a lot again for the time. Let me just give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. And I think of this as a conversation. I have a very conversational style of engaging, and we'll be sharing follow-up slides and things like that. But I want to sort of think of this as a story. And in my experience, and all of us actually spend a lot of time, one of the fun things is I spend a lot of time in a lot of different companies. I was just thinking about it this morning, all the different companies that I've actually been in, either doing workshops or consulting or teaching in the last 15 or so years. And some things are the same and some are different. And I think what we want to share with you today is thinking about success from maybe a different perspective. And so we're going to talk a little bit about a very preeminent business thinker, Peter Drucker, and some of his thoughts on that, and why strategy execution is so critical. What does that have to do with the whole project world that a lot of us live in, which is a lot? What does it look like when we do it well? What does it look like when it doesn't do well? And then a couple of things that you can start doing right now. And I would know from my experience teaching at Stanford that some of the things I'm going to share with you, some of you know, and some you may not. So here's what I'd like to challenge you is, as we go through and I'm talking, be thinking about it. You have a question, you have some feedback. You say, well, I'm not sure about this. Make sure and get on that feature there around the Q&A and send us the question, and then we can address it at the end or following up after the webinar. Secondly, if you see something and say, oh, I know that, one of the things that I've learned to be on the lookout for is, maybe the people I lead don't know that, or can I look at it in a different way? So if I'm looking at a lot of times at a website or listening to somebody talk, I'd say, well, gosh, I know all about that. That's PM 101. But yet if I step back and look at it with fresh eyes and ears, I might actually see a different perspective. So I'd like to challenge all of you to sort of do that as we go through. Now, here's an exciting thing. If you look at our registrants, we're from a lot more countries than I realized. We put this on, this is a really neat, incidentally, an app called ZMAP, Z-E-E Maps, that we use in a lot of our courses where we have people in distributed locations. So obviously we have a lot in Canada and the US. We pretty much cover about 30 states. And then we have some folks from Europe, UK, Spain, and then somebody from Abu Dhabi. I don't know if they're up right now, but we appreciate having all of you on there. And then you might be interested in the industries that are represented. It's fascinating. Sort of in the health area, we have healthcare and medical devices, biotech, pharmaceuticals, financial services and insurance, banking, sort of that kind of thing, credit cards. And then in the sort of the big IT space, real big, we have hardware, software, big global services companies, and all you would recognize the names. And then underlying that, we have folks in manufacturing that manufacture those products and that we sell. And then over we have some folks in nonprofit, NGOs, government sector, and then sort of an interesting set of people in manufacturing related to aerospace, oil and gas services. I guess that's a very challenging business right now. And finally, logistics. So it's just really fantastic to have this mix. And it really sets us up. Because right at the beginning, what I want to share with you is, why in the world are we in business? And you say, well, John, we got to make money. Well, let's step back from this just a little bit. And Drucker really, in a very seminal book that he wrote in 60 years ago called The Practice of Management, when you read this book, you would think, was this written yesterday? No, it was written long ago. And he says the purpose of a business is to create a customer. Now, most of us say, I never thought about it that way. And so Drucker says, well, how do we go about creating that customer? And incidentally, for those of you that may be, say, in a government sector or a nonprofit or foundation sector, same thing. You have to redefine what you mean by customer. Is it those that you serve? Is it your stakeholders? Every organization has a customer. So the purpose is then, how do I create them? And Drucker really hits the nail on this. And if you think about this, it's pretty easy to understand, is that you do that by meeting their needs and wants. You say, okay, what is that? All right. So after this seminar today, I say, I'm going to go to, let's say, to Starbucks. I want to go have, it's raining, I want to go have a nice cup of coffee. And I go in there and they offer a holiday spice latte. I didn't know I wanted one of those. I had never heard of one until a few weeks ago. And so they create this in the sense of serving me as a customer, my needs and wants. And what happens is they created me as a customer. I didn't know I wanted one of those, but once I had it, I said, yes, I want more of that. So sometimes those needs and wants are things that we know about right now, like I need to have a new laptop or a new phone or something, or it's something I don't know. And the example that jumps to my mind really is the whole tablet market. In 2009, I travel a lot, and I had a nice laptop and everything. I didn't know I needed a laptop, a tablet, in this case an iPad. But once I got one, I said, how can I live without it because of my travel schedule? So there was a need and want that Apple created that customer that I didn't know I needed. So just think about that, creating needs and wants. Now, you can see there over on the right, for the next 2 or 3 slides, we've got some questions, and I think when you get this, it'll be a good reference, is to go back and ask yourself who your customers are, what do they need and want. You say, well, duh, we know that. I will challenge you to ask that question very sincerely and strategically. A lot of times we're not clear who the customer is. And I'll give you a really good example. We've done some work in the medical field with device companies that make things hopefully you never need inside your body. In the old days, like 5 years ago, the main customer was to convince the key surgeons. If the surgeons liked your product, they would use it in their operating rooms. But over time, then the next thing was at the hospital. Okay, took that away. And so now it's not just the surgeon, but the hospital makes that buying decision on not just surgery, but also financial. Now we have big health systems. Some of you work for large health systems. Those health systems are the ones that are making the key decisions. So if you're serving that market, that is evolving. So very, very important here. So purpose of a business is to create a customer. We do that by meeting their needs and wants. How do we do that? Drucker said we do that primarily through two sort of management functions or activities, marketing and innovation. And if you think about what marketing is, who can use this? How do I learn that you have a service I want? That type of thing. And the innovation is basically how we create what I'm going to offer. And guess what? We create products, processes, services, facilities, whatever your business is, that's what you create. That's the innovation part that then you do to these identified customers or new customers that you're creating. Now, that's an expansive way of thinking about innovation, but I want you to keep in mind because I think it's very, very important, because you start to listen to this really carefully. Innovation is basically how do you create the products, the services, the processes, etc., that enable you to either give them to a customer, sell them to them, or to have the infrastructure to do that. And I hope your brain has said right now, how do we do that? We do that through project-based work. Let me say it one more time. This is really important. I know talking around the country, I think a lot of us in this community don't think this way. We think innovation is something that's over there in R&D and whatever. No. Every single project, program, initiative, whatever your company calls them, that you're doing is innovation. That's the engine for change and growth in your organization. And that's why what we're talking about here, bridging this gap, is so daggone critical. If you don't get that and you're not doing it correctly, you're in big trouble. Now, Drucker goes on and talks about this a little bit more and says that basically you're staying in business and being successful is you're being able to do these innovative products and services. And you can't sit on your butt. That's an English word for, get up and do something. And so you're constantly having to think about how do you outthink your competitors. And I would add one thing in there when you think about your organization. What we see, and think if you see this, is who your competitors are is really changing. In almost every industry, that whole landscape, that market space, if you will, is radically changing and evolving. Just think about what mobile has done and how that is changing every day almost is another article, study about the importance of mobile. And you say, well, that doesn't affect my business. Oh, yes, it does. And I would challenge you, make sure those you're leading, if you're ever in a meeting and people are saying, well, that doesn't affect my business, I would do a timeout right there, get some Post-its, get up on the wall and say, let's think about this really carefully. Because the companies that are thinking that way, you've got your head in the sand and you're not realizing you're going to have to continually innovate. I'll give you a really good example. Last week I was with a group from Ericsson at Stanford, and these were telecommunication sort of executives. We were talking about company culture. And if you look at their business, large telecoms and everything, if you go back, say, 5 or 10 years, and I'm not sharing anything with you that's confidential, this is you can go on their website and see some of their presentations, is in the past, the focus was on hardware, big time. So about 70–75% of the people, the energy, the effort was on hardware, maybe 25 to 35, 40% was software. Now that has completely flipped. The software, the services associated with it are much more important than the hardware. You still need the hardware, it's still important, it's still part of what they offer, but it's flipped. Now think about think about it in your business, the difference between people that are focused on things that are tangible and things that are not. And the hardware mindset, software mindset, it's very hard to meld those. So this is the kind of thing that Drucker's talking about, and the needs to basically make sure you have skills associated with that. So you may have been trained in, say, hardware. Now your company's having to spend a lot of time in software. You can see this. Just think about this in your own industry. The examples of this are all over the place. Okay. Sorry, I got off that a little bit. I'm really excited about this, and I'm just glad to be able to share with it. So now, if you think about what Drucker's saying, purpose of a business is to create customers. You do that through meeting their needs and wants. The two primary areas are market and innovation. Here's the thing, I want to read those two little bullets right there. You innovate through project-based work, period, no exceptions. So anytime somebody in your organization is talking about we need to be more innovative, et cetera, what they're talking about, we need to be doing our projects and project-based work better and making sure it's strategically aligned with where we want to be as an organization. And so what we're going to talk about here a little bit is, given that powerful hook that innovation is driven by project-based work, it's really critical that strategy is really hooked to execution. Now you'd say, gosh, yes, we do that, but if you look at organizations that are challenged, often there's major disconnects here. And you can see there in some of the questions down to the right that we have some of the classic ways that you would think about that. But I want you to sort of keep that in mind as we go through here and say, okay, well, what do we do about this? Well, I got a little diagram here. I'm a very visual person. Somebody the other day told me, said, well, John, I'm not visual. And I said, well, tell me what your home office looks like, or the living room in your apartment. Busted. All of us think visually, so don't ever let anybody on your team. Some people really say, oh, I got to have it in writing. We're all visual, so just as an aside here. So if you think about strategy execution, let me just walk through this. Obviously, we all like to say, oh, we have a high-performing organization, and that's really what our company is focused on, is helping people around the world enhance the performance of the people that make up that company. You know, no people, no company. So let's start thinking about this a little bit. At least to my knowledge, there's no company that's purely virtual without people involved. You got to have people in there. So we have this high-performing organization that will be defined in some way, maybe by shareholders, stakeholders, maybe government requirements. Think of an examples in the news right this minute is how Volkswagen is wrestling with all of the diesel emission changes and things like that. That is a great case study to watch this. Okay, now, so to have that, we want to grow and retain our customers. Drucker talks about it's not that you just want to create that customer will go away. They will literally go away. Think about in your own life, your own personal life, where you have changed who you bought something from, or you've changed where you shopped, or you've changed how you shopped. I'm just thinking about right off the bat something like an Amazon when they came along, or travel. You don't talk to travel agents. That's been disintermediated completely. And so if you're in that business, you've had to rethink completely. How do I serve people? Maybe it's mainly through very efficient software, things like that, rather than having a lot of agents. So you got to both grow and retain. Remember what Drucker said, we do that through marketing and innovation. And a critical thing is that both of those need to be tied into strategy. And that's sort of the gap. We're going to talk here a little bit and have a little graphic for you later in terms of aligning that. But often there's a major gap there. The articulated organization-wide strategies are not often, I guess, cascaded down is a good way to think about it very well. The execs think everybody understands it, but they don't. Then you see a lot of misalignment, which is, as we'll see, is a big problem. And then finally, down there at the bottom, we just use the term project-based work, is that basically you cannot have any of that above without project-based work. It's the foundation, it's the driver. And I think one of our challenges, I'm assuming all of you either lead people or you lead projects yourself, is that we need to really up our game in thinking about this and tying that to not only to strategy but to innovation. I'm just talking to a large financial company yesterday. We were on a phone call. Oh, we want to do innovation. And I said, well, time out a minute. What was the last big program you had? And they said, oh, it was a major transactional overhaul. Was that innovative? Was it new? Was it different and added value? Yes. All right, that's innovation. And they had this idea that that was not. Innovation was over here in a box in the corner, and we had to hire somebody to be innovative. And that is just a very old school way of thinking about it. And actually, it's not just old school, it's bad for business. So I want you to get in your head that project-based work is the driver for it is innovation. And I would push back, I wish we were all sitting around, having a cup of coffee or tea, we could talk about this, it'd be fun with a whiteboard, is that if somebody says, oh, no, it's not, I said, I want you to tell me one thing in your company that was different, that was improved, that was changed, new process, revision of an old process, new product, revision of old, and tell me if you can do that without projects. it's not. I haven't yet to find, it's not, it just doesn't happen. So we need to really, you know, ratchet this up and say, yes, this is really important, okay? If you can see my face, I'm sort of jumping around right now because I think this is something that when I teach and all and those kind of things at Stanford and other places, I get really excited. So I'm sort of excited about this. You don't have to agree with me. Send me a chat, say, John, you're off the wall here. But I really think it's not just me, but a lot of us think we've missed the boat here. We really need to rethink this, how we think about project-based work. And it is just absolutely critical it's done well, and that's why we're all talking. You want to do that better. We would like to, you know, give you some ideas and also be part of that. Now, there's a lot of data out there. Sometimes I wish I'd never had a graduate class in statistics, because every time I see a percent, I was talking with Ann and Jessica, we were working on this, and I see these numbers and I say, okay, what's the reference? You know, what's the sample size? All of this, and so my brain is constantly going back in statistical mode. But this is not a statistical class, so we won't worry about that. But there is a lot of stuff that we're having trouble with this. And I have a very large Evernote database around strategy execution, and one of my notebooks in that is basically around culture and also around big failures. But there are also opportunities, and I think sometimes it's how we, if you look at this data here, maybe it's how we define things, and we're not, how do I want to say this, we're not stepping back and saying, you know, maybe we need some different numbers. But when you see things are not successful, and you pick your number there that you like or one that concerns you, all of them, what they all have in common, we can do this better. And I think it's sort of funny to ask somebody, is strategy important? I would love to talk to the 12% who think it's not important, what kind of business they're in. They either didn't understand the question or they don't know what strategy is, because that's, even if you don't have an espoused strategy, you have ways that you're doing things and you make choices which, you know, show us that strategy. And just really interesting. So if you look at all of those, the important thing is this stuff is important, and how you execute it's important, and all of you are the engines for that. And so I just want to, you know, reinforce that as we talk about that. Now, this poor fella, he's having a rough day. Things don't always work well, and so if you look, let me show back the previous slide. So you see all these things are not always good as we want. And what are some of the elements of that? And if you look at that set, you can just think about your own organization. If you've been in business very long, or your company has, something is always happening. And this makes me think of you know, a lot of companies use dashboards of red, amber, green, red, yellow, green, you know, stuff like that. And I remember when this company once, very large, you know, billions of dollars, and they showed me their dashboard for this big program. Everything was green or yellow. And I said, what's going on here? And they said, well, everything's good. I said, well, I don't see any red. They said, well, we really work. We don't want to be red. And so we talked about it. And the point out of that is that nobody wanted to be red. And it's that big, complex projects and programs always have something that's red. If there's something that's not requiring your attention as a leader, then it's not a very complex effort. Things happen. They're not that anybody intentionally sets out. But when I look at these types of lists that we all know about, you see them so much, and the things that happen when strategy execution is really not fully aligned. And the team morale, as an example, is something that I think is just a killer. Is when you have really poorly run, well, you know, poorly designed efforts. The people leave that team, their tails between their legs, their heads down, just like this fella, and you're not just raring to go in the next project. So if you think about it from an organizational capability point of view, this is not only bad for that gentleman as an individual, but it's bad for you as a company. And that's why this stuff we're just trying to hit you on the head a little bit. It's really, really important to understand that this matters to you as a leader and to those that you lead. And you could pick, you know, I was just thinking it's probably 20 other bullets we could pick there. And typically those are going to be a function of different factors. Now, if you step back and you wanted to see, well, what are we doing? One of the best ways to do that is to just look at the portfolio of project-based work. That's what the company's decided, either by design or by default, hopefully by design. Here's the work we're doing. That tells you what they say is important. And oftentimes, one of the fun things to do is to basically look at a company's portfolio before you ever look at the beautiful 20-color document that's their strategy document. Because a lot of times what you'll see is this wonderful strategy document, and probably spent millions of dollars developing it, but it is not connected to the portfolio of things that are invested in. And that's really what we're talking about here. When you talk about strategy execution, ultimately those portfolio decisions determine what it is you're going to be executing on. So when you look at those, you can tell really quickly, are they aligned? You know, is what we're doing, are our criteria aligned with the strategy? Now, I look at that Jenga game there. One of my granddaughters loves this game, and if any of you ever played it, you know, the objects to remove as many blocks you can without everything falling down, and it's constantly changing, and just like a company. And if you think about a lot of the things we're doing in business right now, just like that, you know, we're reorganizing, we're collapsing, we're saying, okay, 10 people can do what 30 did. So I think that's interesting that we have that. Okay, now, nobody said this is easy. The strategy, and that's why we all make the big bucks, right? I told my kids once, they were moaning about something in some of their first jobs. I said, look, what you want is to always have stuff that's pushing you. And if you're doing the same thing over and over and over, then you need to be on a production line. And you're not going to get paid a lot, and you're ultimately going to be very bored. So alignment not being easy is fine. I don't think alignment will ever be easy. You can take every course we had. You can go to every university. You're still going to have a problem with this because we are dealing with people. And we have a course called Executing Complex Programs, and complex, you know, there's a whole lot of study about complexity, but one of the interesting things is that complexity implies a set of sort of organic things coming out of your work, and what I call emergent properties. So no matter what you do with your project or program, you can say, okay, it's going to be blah, 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 blah. Something is going to happen. And what I see, even smaller efforts now, business is so dynamic, change is ever present, that you've got to be ready to handle that. And some of the factors that really show up there, you can see, is that you need to really be considering all of these, and you look and say, my gosh, all of these are important? Yes. And I think sometimes we think of say a project and the company as a very mechanistic, and unfortunately our organizational charts reinforce that, but they're organic. They have people make decisions, they do things you would never dream of that cause problems or, you know, opportunities. And so if you could pick any one of those, you know, is it the structure? The structure may be pushing against. We talk about the importance of having your structure and your culture and your strategy fully aligned. And in a lot of organizations where they're having problems with that, and I'm not picking on VW, I just read an article in the Financial Times this morning about their culture around this emission problems. And basically, if you look at, they had a strategy to come into, say, the U.S. market with diesel cars, but there was a misalignment with their culture, and not with the structure, but between the culture and the strategy, and being consistent with that in an ethical and, you know, business-like way. It's fascinating to read about this because other companies have similar challenges. They may not be as big or whatever. So all I'm trying to say here is this alignment's not easy. There's a whole bunch of factors here that are really critical, and that's part of the reason you constantly want to be looking at, well, how do I enhance the skills and knowledge so that I can achieve what you see there on this slide about, so you can avoid this misalignment. And this is just another set of, if you think why strategies fail, strategy may actually be pretty daggone good, but it's basically totally out of sync with the culture and structure. And this becomes, we are finding, even more important with the extensive set of mergers and acquisitions that are going on. I spent 2 weeks ago, I was with a large medical device company, and the team there of program leaders were very senior, and they were all leading the integration. This company had bought another company, a very large merger. And what was interesting is listening to them talk about the differences in culture. Both the companies were, let's just say, pharmaceutical type or companies, and they thought they had compatible cultures, but they are not similar cultures. And they are having to spend so much more time understanding that and figuring out how to get everybody on the same page. The techniques, the technical aspects of merging finance and all that, that's really quite easy relative to how do you merge people in the way they do things. Very fascinating. So you can see, pick one of those. The complexity can be such that basically the misalignments occur because everybody's really not sure who's on first. And if you've ever been in a large company that's gone through some of these changes, you know that, or you have a major hiccup in the marketplace, it can be quite challenging, especially large companies where you have, you know, thousands of people distributed around the universe, if you will. The risk may not be understood. There's a great book called Anti-Fragile by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. He also wrote Fooled by Randomness. If any of you are really interested in risk, I would highly encourage you to watch a video of him on YouTube or something like that. But there's some of those sort of black swan things we will not anticipate. But there are other times we could do things. There's a lot of interesting tools that we talk about in terms of understanding those risks, and you need to do it in a different way than we did 10 years ago because the risks surface in ways that we didn't think about before. Now, interesting little aspect, inadequate resources. Let's just cut to the chase. I've yet to be in a team, whether it was a $50 million project or a $1 million project or $500,000, that didn't want more resources. Rarely are they fully resourced. I can think of a few companies, I won't mention them, that are very well known, but where that's the case, but usually it's not. Often it's not the number of people, it's the skills, the people they need, and all of us know that, especially in knowledge workers, those skills and experience are really critical. And a lot of times you can say, well, I have people, but they're not the right ones. So having the skills not matching the needs, we have a great quote, I should have put it on the slide here, is availability is not a skill set. Let me say that again, availability is not a skill set. And I tell you, it's really amazing the number of times people said, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I needed 3 people with expertise at X, Y, and Z, and the best ones were not available, but the head of that particular function said, well, these people are really great, they're just out of school or whatever, and so we all know that. Now, if you look at that misalignment, you can see here a range of failure points. And what I'd like for you when you get these slides is to go back and look at them afterwards later and say, what are the failure points in your space? It could be that it could be something as simple as the skills, there's a gap. And what we see, people are coming into businesses, they're getting responsibility much faster. Unless you're in a very old hierarchical business, which some of you are, so you have to work your way up. In other settings, there's somebody 25 running an effort that's $30 million. It used to, that person would have had to been there another 10 years. So you have this mix of people coming in. If you're in a technical space, they will have okay, I have an EE degree, or I'm a computer scientist, or a mechanical engineer, or I'm a supply chain management degree. But often there are additional skills around the whole project-based workspace. You don't get that in university. It's just not there. It's not part of it. So you have that problem. You can have the problem about if you're in a merger situation or acquisition, we have 500 different ways of doing it. That inadequate methodology is inconsistent is a minefield, and thinking about it consciously and how you do that. Leadership challenges. In some ways, if I could have a magic wand, I would do away with the term project manager. And somebody said, well, why are you saying that? And I said, well, because assuming there's more than one person on your team, you better be a leader. I can't think of anything more important. You do not manage people. And a lot of people much more famous than I ever aspire to be who say this, is that you lead people, you manage resources and things, not people. So that leadership challenge, is put a big X right there because it's really critical. And a lot of times what happens, we promote people into things because they're great technically, but they are lousy leaders. So that's the things you see there is just spot on. Required skill sets don't match. Somebody being a leader and dealing with people, if you're a very technical person, I'm like that, it's a different thing. And you really need exposure to ways of doing that, learning how to do that. Really, really important. And Google did a great study a few years ago called Project Oxygen that, if you're interested, Google it and you'll see it. And basically looked at what were the attributes of people that were successful managers and leaders of efforts there in Google. And granted, it's Google with their type of culture, but here's what, and this is all database, very data-driven company, as you know. And what the data, there were 8 key attributes. The first 7 were leadership skills, people skills. Only number 8, and they were rank ordered, was your technical chops. So what made somebody a good leader was really that they had those people skills, not first. Doesn't mean you don't have the technical, but for some really interesting, called Project Oxygen. You Google it, very interesting. And then finally, the management misalignment. And this is what we were talking about, the strategy gap between, how do we bridge the gap and all. It's really quite interesting that when you think about that. And, what do we do? And so what I want to share with you real quick is, just watching our time, so we'll have some time for Q&A here in a few minutes, is, well, what's some things that that we'll do if you look at what this high-powered alignment, I guess we'd say. So right here, woe is us, failure points, and you can add to that. We could have 15 slides on that. I personally don't think that's good to have that. Here they are. But then you say, well, what do we do? And what does that look like? So then here's this world that might look like that, And if you look at any one of those, you say, well, how do I get there? Well, it doesn't just happen. It's actually a project, if you think about it. Is every one of those different companies excel in some others. Some have really robust approaches. Others don't have a clue. Some it's a mishmash, but they're successful because they're in a high margin business, things like that. So you really want to get in this alignment. And what we wanted to share with you was just some ideas about some things you could start thinking about right now. And then I want to share with you sort of a skills bridge that pulls us all together. And then we'll get into our Q&A here. We're coming up in about 7 or 8 minutes. So be thinking about if you've got send in any questions or things you want. I know we have a few already, but if you have some more, we'd love to have that. So some of the things you can do now. Now, I look at number 1 and say, if you could see my face, it's sort of quizzical. Why don't we understand strategy? Because the only way to execute that strategy and bring new and innovative things in my company is through project-based work. And so what we've noticed, and why we suggest this, is a lot of times there is like a glass wall or a glass floor. It's like a total disconnect. So one of the first things you want to look at is look at your large project-based work and make sure it really is tied to the strategy. Just, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I heard somebody say, well, why do my PMs need to know this? I wanted to pick that guy up and shake him and look him in the eye. He said, because what they do is strategically important to your organization. So I would challenge you, if you don't have that thinking in your company, you ought to. So everybody that's leading a project, whether it's big, small, the biggest thing that you've ever done, needs to understand the strategies of the company and how that project fits into that. This part of being in good business. I think we're missing something here, and we really want to reinforce that. If you're already doing that, give yourself a big gold star, great. Secondly, highest level of sponsorship. This is actually what I would call PM 101, but you know what? We still see it being a problem. Basically, I learned the hard way. I was doing multidisciplinary programs at a Research Triangle Institute in North Carolina. It's applied R&D. People would pay us to do research, mostly more in the D side, not the pure research. And I learned really quickly when we were working with customers and all that if you didn't have a sponsor or executive overlooking that at the right level, it was a waste of time. They didn't help you. And so I hope all of you understand this. There's many books about this, but we've seen this to be really, you want the highest possible level. Why? Because the complexity and challenges of the work we're doing today cut across companies. I can't think, if you can think of one, please send it to me so I can use it, of any kind of a complex project or program that doesn't cut across a lot of functions, a lot of parts of the org chart, and throw in that it's globally distributed. You need somebody that's got some chops that when you need them, they can go to bat for you. And that's always how I thought about sponsorship. But we're seeing that's not there. And if you're talking about alignment and having to move things to get that alignment, you need somebody in your camp that's got it. Okay, and number 3 is really the where are we? It's funny, sometimes we're so busy doing the work, we can't step back and say, what's sort of our current state? And it's sort of, whether it's an organizational assessment or something, of understanding where are we in terms of our strategy alignment. We really, is that strategy and execution fully aligned with the overall strategy? And Ann's going to tell you a little bit at the end here about a webinar we're having next month. Follow on to this. We'll give you some additional tools to think about that. Now, appropriate metrics. This is fun. I sort of laugh about this because we were putting together a module for one of our classes at Stanford around metrics and got in a big argument about metrics. And I'm a devotee. Yes, I love numbers. Yes, we need numbers, but there's a whole lot of other stuff you need to know about how's it going. And you can look at major projects that have problems, and they will have so many metrics and so much data. You say, well, how do they not see that? And so part of the challenge here is figuring out what's the right level, and how do you tie, do those metrics really tie to the overall goals and objectives as they're espoused in the strategies? And that's what we're talking about here. This is something that when you ask, a lot of people say, oh, well, I'm on budget, blah, 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 blah. I say, hey, time out, wait a minute. What's the overall bigger strategy here? And what are you supporting that? How do you know that? What happens after you've completed the product or the process? How do you know it delivered what? And you know, we use stuff like benefits realization and some fancy words like that. But you know what? We don't do this very well. I say we in business, period. We get it out the door and move on to the next thing. So this is a big challenge. And finally, this talent development. I work a lot in Silicon Valley and companies in there. And this talent development, management, keeping the talent you want to have is a big, big, big challenge. And so how you do that, thinking about that strategically, and even if people ultimately in certain industries leave, you say, well, gosh, they've done all this training and education, is they are an ambassador for your company when they leave. And a lot of times we don't think about that. And there's so much turnover all now. I think we need to think about that, make sure we've got things. Now, let me wrap this up here before we have our little Q&A and share with you a metaphor. I think that's the right word. I have to go back and look at my English dictionary, but we're using something as an example when we think about strategy and execution, and how do we bridge that? That's why we're calling it bridging the gap. And actually, the gaps can be all over the place, but if you think about going from strategy to execution, and this ties back to what Peter said, Peter Drucker, is that, you remember he said, purpose of a company is to create customers. They do that by meeting the needs and wants. And how do you meet those needs and wants? You do that through market and innovation. And what is the innovation? It's creating the products, services, facilities, processes, either new or revisions that help you meet those needs and wants. And he said, oh, by the way, that innovation requires that you have the skills necessary to do that. Now, obviously, you hire somebody to come in, but business is so rapidly changing that those skills can all change. Plus, you may be hiring people that don't have the skills you need. And so what we've tried to capture here is give you some of the elements of that, and we'll talk more about it in the next webinar. But let me just sort of, if you look at those two piers of thinking about the Golden Gate, we try to have the Golden Gate in there, but the Golden Gate's too big. But basically, there are big two massive piers there that hold that up. And you see why it says technical and relational. And these are just ways, there's not an easy way to think about this, but the technicals, you know the technical things you need to do, whether it's being a SME in supply chain logistics and you're building out a new SAP module that you're bringing in, how you do your supply chain, very technical. And you can see there, whether it's managing the contract, business analysis, you use Agile. There's a lot of different aspects of that, very technical. Sometimes we get that in university. Most of the times we see you need to have a lot of additional skills in that space. Now, if you look over on the right, you'll see the relation. And incidentally, the bridge will fall if you don't have do well in both of these. So you can be very weak in one or the other. It is going to be really sort of dicey going. If you've ever been across a bridge that's moving in high winds, you'll appreciate this a lot. So the relational is that thing that Google talked about with Project Oxygen. It's the first 7 out of 8. Really critical. Serving as a leader, understanding what does it mean to lead people. And as I just mentioned, we're in the knowledge world here, and if you don't do that well, you're going to have problems. And it's even harder, and a lot of the skills we're talking about here, because you are almost always using globally distributed teams that are in multiple time zones, multiple cultures, multiple business cultures, you name it. So just think about it. It's fun, but God, it's hard. And so those two piers are sort of underlying. You see across the top, and we sort of broke it out: foundations, mechanics. You can see up the left, and advanced. And ultimately, you're trying to have a strategic view of the kind of skills, experience, expertise your team needs to execute its strategy through project-based work. And why is that important? Daggone it, that's how your company innovates, that's how it stays in business, that's how it brings to the world the things that we need. So can't say enough about that. I want to, you guys have been great. We get ready to have our Q&A here, and I want to just leave you with one thing before we do the Q&A. We'll do follow-up. You're going to have my way to contact me if you have questions or something. You know, I love to share information or ask questions. I don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers, but we do have those, a really great palette of ways of helping you meet the various needs here across the way. Sometimes it's very simple. Remember walking into a company out in San Diego? They had a whole bunch of ex-military people in there. They were all sharp. They were gung-ho. They were there at 7:45 for the 8 o'clock class. Well, they didn't have a clue how to lay out a timeline, what we might think of as a schedule. They just never had to do it that way. And so they needed that basic skill. You might have another group, they've been in business a long time, or maybe it's a startup and a lot of them are running $30, $40, $50 million little efforts. They need not only that, they need that strategic part too. So all of that together is a piece, and it's a good way to think about it. So Ann, you want to come in and sort of tell us how we're going to do the Q&A?
John, thank you so much. We truly appreciate your insights during this very informative session. At this point, we will begin a Q&A session to address some of the many questions that have been coming in throughout the presentation. Just so everyone knows, because of the quantity of great questions coming in, we will have to table some of them for after the webinar. John has already graciously agreed to answer questions, and we will send the answers to these questions along with the follow-up materials. So John, the first question posed was, what challenges do globally distributed teams face in closing that gap between strategy and execution?
Well, what I would say is, what challenges don't they face? But just quickly, and I sort of alluded to that, that's actually a good question, Ann, is that if you have a globally distributed team, and let me just back up a second, there is actually research. We don't have to be in different countries. Once you get a cohesive team that is spread out over multiple buildings or even multiple floors in the same building, the communication goes up by a cube. Okay, so it becomes much more challenging. Then if you're in a different geographic location, then you throw in a different country, then you throw in a different time zone, then you throw in just a different way of working. I've taught classes at Google, and one of the interesting things, Google has a very dynamic and exciting culture. Yet, when you go to different Google offices, you know you're there. In other words, the office in Santa Monica has a very different vibe than the one in New York City. It has a different focus. Still Google. In Santa Monica, you're likely to place it may be dead from 2 to 6 if there's some really good waves. You don't have that in New York City. They're in the advertising space. So even though it's still Google, so part of the globally distributed teams thing, I think, is trying to understand and reflect that it is going to be different, and what can you do about it. So just a couple of quick things about that. Yes, it's critical. It makes it harder to close that gap. I'm not sure we'll ever close it. I'll just be really honest with you and if you look at the research, if you look at what people do, this is an ongoing thing we have to always work at. And you say, well, of course we can close it. You know what? You make a pretty good jump. What will happen is the market will change. The people who work for you will change. Those of you that are outside the U.S. or have companies or have teams outside, think of the turnover in the IT services industry in India. Very different than here in the U.S. And so you can have that globally distributed team, think everything's going great, we've got our culture aligned, strategy aligned, et cetera, but bang, you got in a whole new set of people and you just thought you got everything laid out, you got to start all over again. And that's why I think Drucker talks about this being that continuous process. And the kind of skills and knowledge that's needed is going to be continuous. So I would just say what that globally distributed team means is that you have to do this even more. You have to consciously think about it and have the people that support you do that. Okay?
Great, John. The second question was, are there certain skills or areas of expertise that seem to be more critical than others in achieving alignment?
Which skills not critical might be a better way of saying that. I would say though, and this is one area that I think there is I think the people, if you look at our, let me just push this back one. So if you look at the bridge, I think those relational skills are absolutely critical. It doesn't mean you don't need the others. The relationship is worthless if you don't have the others, but I think if you look at the way business is and trying to close the gap, my experience has been the bigger challenges in closing the gap between strategy and execution are more around relational. The foundational technical kind of things we know about. We may not be rolling them. We may not have the right ones. That's why doing an assessment is really important to understand what you need. You may have a great program and are training people in the wrong thing. And it takes a lot of guts to admit that, but sometimes you see that. So I would say the people skills. I think a second set, let me just tell a real quick story about this. Ali Mulally came from Boeing Aircraft to head up Ford Motor Company in 2005. He's an engineer, really sharp guy, and fantastic leader. And Alan is an engineer, but he didn't know a lot about cars. And so what he had to do was pick up some skills over there. If you look on the left part of that, he had to pick up what are the skills he needed. He would talk to people in auto design and things that were new to him, not to become an expert in it, but to know enough so that he could lead them. So I think, and what we're talking about here is a combination of relational skills are critical, but you also may be leading a group where you need to do some upskilling on your own, and I can think of a lot of examples. I'm looking here at contract management. Well, I don't want to know anything about that. We have a department for that. Well, you may get in a situation where you need to be critically involved in that because of IP issues. There may be issues around different cultural ways that contracts are perceived. It could be that most of the work you're leading is done by a vendor who has 3 other vendors, and all of a sudden you need to know something about contract management, not to be a contract manager, but to better lead that larger effort. So I think that's how I would answer that.
Great, John. And while you were talking about the bridge, there was a question specific to that bridge metaphor.
Okay.
Is it relevant for companies of all sizes?
I'm going to say yes. There may be a small company. You could have somebody say, what's Walmart's, my revenue is the largest company in the world, and say, well, they got a lot of bridges. But I think generally a metaphor helps. It could be a small company. I'll be honest, I don't work with many small companies. I've worked with and talked with startups here in Boise, but most of the companies are fairly large. But it scales. We talk about a lot in our work about scaling. And the nice thing about this is it scales. So in a small company, what's going to happen is individuals may have to have a broader breadth of skills in one individual rather than 5 individuals. You may be doing a lot of this stuff yourself. If you talk to anybody in a startup, it's exactly. In other words, if we were all a startup and we were talking about this, we would find out real quickly that there's a whole bunch of people that are going to be doing the same thing. Whereas in a large, excuse me, not the same thing, but there's a whole lot of people are going to be doing a lot of things that would be done by one person rather than a lot of people. So I think it scales very well. I think the difference would be that as a company gets larger, this connection with strategy becomes even more critical because you're further from that strategy making part of the organization. So that would be the main thing. You really want to understand how that works probably a lot more. Okay?
Another question that came in, is there one challenge that you see most often as either the most common or daunting? I'm going to mention one you're not going to expect, and that's how we run meetings. And you say, oh gosh, I don't see that. Yes, that's a skill. And if I could redo that, if I could add to it, I'd put a little box that says meeting skills. And the reason meeting skills are so important, I was reading an article last year that said meetings are the factory floor for knowledge workers. I'll say it one more time. Meetings are the factory floor for knowledge workers. That's what we do with project-based work. And if you ask people, and they'll say, oh gosh, I'm in meetings all the time. Oh my gosh, I'm in meetings. Time out. Let's talk about this. And so what you see, what I see is thing that the biggest challenge and the skill that could add the most value almost immediately is change how we do meetings. And there's a lot of things out there about this, but somehow we're not doing it. And probably if we were trying to do that and improve that, I would say think consciously about improving how we run meetings, how we organize them, all the things that all of us know but we don't do. Don't have people on phones or any other technology during a meeting. All the research is showing this is a mistake. There's a lot of rebellion now coming back, and you say, well, I can't. Well, time out.
The research is showing through functional MRIs and others, you don't multitask. Your brain does rapid switching. And if you're in a meeting, ask yourself, A, why we're having the meeting, B, and it better be because it's the best use of that set of people. Don't ever have people making six-figure salaries reading slides to people who make six-figure salaries. If you're doing that in your company, shame on you, and figure out a better way to do it. It's a waste of time. And I have a lot of people interested. I can give you some reference. There's a lot of stuff to do in this, but I see this over and over. So one skill would be understanding how do you better do meetings. You say, well, what does that have to do with closing the gap? A whole lot, because the way you close that gap is by executing better and connecting that to your strategic objectives. All of that requires meetings. So meetings are a leverage. They're something that's they're an accelerator. If you can do that better, it's going to impact the entire effort. So that would be my takeaway there.
Great. The next question is alignment a short or a long-term goal for a company?
I'd change the adjective and say it's really a continuous goal. And this actually goes back to what Drucker was talking about. Is yes, you want to, hey, let's get aligned real quick, but I think, and everybody would agree with this, I think it's a goal that you're constantly moving towards. And just when you say, we're aligned, something's going to happen. That's what's different from in the past. We used to talk about there's a little bit of white water in the river, let's get through the white water, then it all calms out for 2 or 3 years, gone. I can't think of any company in any of those industries that are reflected here. Those industries are in a state of flux, big time. And that flux means that the alignment that you're doing is going to constantly be going back and forth. And the analogy I like to use, maybe it's not a perfect one, is we're flying from LA to Hawaii. Well, wouldn't that be nice? We're going to Honolulu specifically. That jet takes off. We know where we're going, Honolulu International Airport. No doubt about it. It's going to be bad if we don't make that because there's water around there. But the whole time we're going, the pilot is constantly adjusting. The winds move. There may be one engine has a problem in the feed, and they have to shut that down and keep going. He has to make adjustments for that. We still get to the same goal. We're constant. And I think that's what is happening in business. That alignment between strategy and execution, the overall corporate effort here, is you're constantly moving towards. And you're going to get close, and sometimes you're going to say we're there, but you're going to have to constantly be adjusting. And this really goes back to why you want to look at the skills that are needed to do that. It's not a one-off. It's really an ongoing, for as long as you want to stay in business. Okay. Hey, incidentally, thank all of you. I think we're about towards the end here, aren't we, Ann? But thank all of you for staying, and look forward maybe to meeting some of you in person or online in some way. Feel free to send me an email or hook up with me on LinkedIn.
Great, John. Thank you again. Unfortunately, that's all the time for questions we have today. There are several that are still in queue that we will get the answers out to everyone. We encourage everyone to learn more about 2080 strategy execution and how we partner with our clients by visiting our website at www.strategyx.com or by contacting John directly via his contact information shown on the screen. As we mentioned, we will send out a link to the recorded webinar session as well as the presentation slides next week in the case that you want to review it again or share it with colleagues. Also, we wanted to mention that there is a follow-up webinar session scheduled for January 28th of 2016 that goes to our academic and industry-proven approach and framework to better align strategy and execution.